Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Basic Handgun Training for K through 12 educators. Due to the increasing number of school shootings and the continued debate about arming school faculty in the United States, there's a critical need for educators to have the basic understanding and confidence with handgun skills. This does not mean that teachers need to be armed in the classrooms, but a strong knowledge of handguns can increase the likelihood of survival and or the protection of others when an option to run or hide are not available. Although adolescent violence and homicides have decreased steadily since 1993, the shock of the incomprehensible loss of life that takes place in our school shootings has rocked our country for decades. I'm sure when you read the above statements and the school names came to mind, like Columbine, Sandy Hook, Stoneman Douglas, to name a few. The main goal of this learning experience is to provide K through 12 teachers with the basic understanding and knowledge and a mindset to be able to safely handle a handgun. Throughout this course, teachers will learn 4 necessary safety rules, the nomenclature of both the semi-automatic revolver and handguns, the functions of both the semi-automatic handgun and revolver, options for proper stance, grips, natural point of aim, the proper way to pull the trigger. Parts of the class will focus on the definition of deadly force and when it may be utilized to protect oneself or others. Our training objectives. After completing the lesson, students must be able to recite the 3 fundamental safety rules. By the end of this lesson, students will be able to explain sight picture and sight alignment. After completing this training, the student will know the 5 marksmanship fundamentals. Each student will be able to justify the use of deadly force using the definition of deadly force and the reasons deadly force would be authorized. Our safety rules. If we can just remember treat, never, keep. Now, some of you who are former military may remember this a little bit differently, but nowadays we have certain weapons that do not have an external safety. Because of that, we've taken it down to 3 simple safety rules. Treat every weapon as if it were loaded. Never point a weapon at anything you do not intend to shoot. Keep your finger straightened off the trigger until you intend to fire. Now, storing a gun safely. There are several different options on how to store a gun safely. For myself, I choose one of the larger safes for both my handguns and my long rifles. Within that, I've also purchased several of the locking mechanisms that go inside of the barrel, make it impossible to chamber around. Pictured are a few. Also, a hyperlink is attached to be able to view some of the safe storage options for your handguns. Getting to know your weapons, the nomenclature. We'd be explaining the slide, the barrel, the hammer, the trigger, the frame of this semi-automatic. Within the semi-automatic, the way that the semi-automatic works is when a round is chambered, a firing pin that is in front of the hammer will strike the round, causing it to ignite the gunpowder that is inside of the casing, causing the bullet to exit the barrel. The gas and the recoil emitted from that explosion causes the slide to go to the rear and then come back forward on the spring that's internal inside of the semi-automatic to chamber another round. That's the cycle of fire for your semi-automatic. When you look at the nomenclature of the revolver, your barrel, your cylinder, your hammer, your frame, and your trigger, the bullet works the same way. The hammer is drawn back to the rear by the trigger pull and then falls forward. At the point of the hammer, there's a firing pin. That firing pin strikes the cylinder, which ignites the gunpowder, sending the round downrange. In the revolver, the cylinder rotates when you pull the trigger a second time, putting a round in front of the hammer. That is the cycle of fire for your revolver. We'll expand a little bit on your nomenclature for the semi-automatic pistol, seeing as the majority of us are going to use a semi-automatic rather than a revolver. We take a look at the front sight post. the slide, the takedown level, or the slide stop, which locks the slide to the rear or releases the slide to chamber around, or just to put the slide forward if the weapon is not loaded. You have the rear sight. Some weapons will still have an external safety, others will not. Your back strap, where the heel of your palm is going to hit. The magazine, front strap, where your fingers are going to interlace around it. Magazine release should be easily accessible by your thumb. Trigger guard to prevent the weapon from accidentally being fired. Your trigger. And then, of course, the frame. Now, this is the basics that a gun owner is going to need. There is a lot more involved in your weapon that could be learned through owner's manuals, webinars, tutorials on the internet, and research that you could do on your own. Now, our shooting fundamentals. Our shooting stance, our grip, the sight picture sight alignment, trigger control, and breathing are your 5 shooting fundamentals. When we talk about stance, the stance is the base for the handgun shooting platform. Not only does a proper stance assist in controlling recoil, it also allows you to move and react quickly and draw your weapon with minimal movement. So when we talk about shooting stance, we talk about the isosceles. Since we're teaching K through 12 teachers, I'm sure that we have several math teachers that know what an isosceles is. So when you take a look at that, you are going to be square. I know an isosceles is a triangle, but you're going to be square with the target, meaning you're going to be facing directly to the target. Your legs should be shoulder width apart. You're forming a triangle with a two-handed grip on the gun, face down range, with both your right and your left arm at the same point of the grip on the gun. Now, when we choose to go to the Weaver stance, the Weaver stance is simply going to have one straight arm. You are going to be bladed, or in other words, you are not going to be square with the target anymore. You're going to be bladed. The idea of this is to make yourself somewhat of a smaller target. And then your weak arm is going to be slightly bent with your strong arm straight down range with the same high firm pistol grip on your gun. Is making sure that you have a good base to be able to start your fundamentals of shooting. When we talk about grip, the proper grip of a handgun. A proper grip aids in controlling recoil and the muzzle flip. It also allows the shooter to obtain a second sight picture more rapidly. High firm pistol grip. Hands must have a 360-degree grip around the weapon. This allows the shooter to engage more rapidly. When you take a look at several of the photos, depending on the size and the shape of your hand, there are going to be multiple grips that may work for you and may not work for you. A person with a larger hand is going to have an easier time doing an interlace grip. A person with a smaller hand is going to want to do what they call the teacup. All of these grips are useful in the proper handling of your handgun. Understanding sight picture and sight alignment. Your front and your rear sight posts should be level. Your front sight tip should be equally positioned between the two rear sight apertures or your rear posts, like the picture above. Our eyes can only focus on one thing at a time, which means that the rear sight aperture and the target should be slightly blurry to guarantee the right sight picture to go along with that sight alignment as pictured below. Trigger control. The proper way to press a trigger on a gun. When pressing the trigger, the shooter should use the tip of the index finger. The photo on the right is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard. When I was in the Marine Corps, I used to literally take a pen and draw a line on the Marine's finger of where it was actually supposed to be on the trigger. In either single or double action mode, depending on which weapon you have, some have single, some have double action, where you could cock the hammer to the rear and have a less distance of a trigger pull to make the hammer fall, or to make your controlled trigger squeeze should be steady until the hammer or the firing pin strike that cylinder and goes off. Breathing is extremely important for shooting fundamentals. It impacts the accuracy of your shot. One can practice sight pictures, sight alignment, natural point of aim, the optimum handgun positions, but if you don't breathe properly, one may never engage a target as accurately as possible. Also, the further away the target is, the more important breathing comes into play. What I just did is a cycle of breathing. And what some of you may have noticed was there's a natural respiratory pause from the time that you breathe in to the time that you breathe out and before you breathe back in. That natural respiratory pause is when you want to squeeze the trigger. Definition of deadly force. Several states have different definitions. Make sure that you know your states. Most of them will sound similar to the one that's listed here. Deadly force means that force which a reasonable person would consider likely to cause death or serious bodily harm. Its use may be justified under conditions of extreme necessity, when all lesser means have failed or cannot reasonably be employed. Your state may differ. The Uniform Code of Military Justice saw deadly force as that force which would cause serious bodily harm or death, or that force in which a reasonable or prudent person would consider likely to cause serious bodily harm or death. When we expand on this a little bit, we've got to talk about when we can use deadly force. As a civilian, the use of deadly force generally justified if he or she reasonably believes that their lives are in imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm. Justification to affirmation defenses may vary by state and may include certain property crimes, specific crimes under children, or the prevention of sexual assault. For this particular class, we're talking about K through 12 teachers whose main concern, the reason why most of you want to understand how to use or the basic functions of a firearm, is because of active shooters coming into your school. But let's think about this. There is nowhere that has been safe from active shooters. And think about it. There is nowhere that has been safe from active shooters. I may believe that the only way to stop a bad man with a gun is a good man with a gun. That doesn't mean everybody sees it that way. But because I know that this can happen anywhere, you have the right to protect yourself and others from deadly force, with deadly force. So if we're talking about a situation that takes place in a school, and you don't have the available means to be able to run or hide, you only have one option. And if that option is taken away from you because you do not have the right to bear arms in your school for one reason or another, the guns work. We understand sight picture, sight alignment. So anything you and your students can do to make it difficult for that shooter to aim would be effective. There are several states that have stand your ground laws. So knowing that in Michigan, you may use deadly force with no duty to retreat if you have a reasonable belief that such force is necessary to prevent the imminent death, great bodily harm, or sexual assault to yourself or to another individual. But if you're not in Michigan, make sure that you know the laws for your state. Thank you for taking the time to go through basic handgun training for K through 12 educators. Please do me a favor and complete the online assessment